and welcome to Book Talk. My name is Bill LEMANSKI, and we'll be discussing this morning Cornwall Landing, Our Times. Our Times is a bit of a misnomer in the title because the book actually covers the 19th century and early 20th century relative to Cornwall and the region. Now, the narrative of the book consists of a number of small vignettes and newspaper articles relative to the time, the place, the people, and the activities of that region. And they're supplemented by numerous interesting photographs, period photographs of the time. Also, what's covered in the book, which I enjoy, are some of the arcane characters that lived in the region at the time. The book would also appeal to railroading buffs. There's a lot of interesting railroad photo art from the period, as well as descriptions of how the railroading in the region developed during that era. But I'd like to read one or two segments that I found really interesting. Just bear with me as I find my location. If you could focus in on this gentleman. He was Mr. Frank Hope, or Hop, however you pronounce the name.
It was Hop. I couldn't get that
Very
word.
well.
It was Hop.
Incidentally, the author of the book, which I should have mentioned, is Mr. Bob McHugh, which I'll introduce in a couple of moments. Well, Mr. Hop was a pool player. He learned to play in his father's pool hall at an early age. He credited his title as world pool champion to avoiding alcohol and tobacco, and he was a resident of the region. They had a hotel called Commercial House. He played pool at the White House with President Taft. A very interesting character. You want to zoom in on that? Some other interesting people who were indigenous to the region. Was Lillian Russell. Lillian Russell was one of the most famous stage actresses and singers of her age. The Russell Cottage on Dean's Point, which is in Cornwall. There's a photo of Miss Russell. As I said, the book has a profusion of very interesting period photographs supporting the narrative. She was a friend of Diamond Jim Brady. I don't know if many people today had heard of him. I had years ago. He was a very wealthy character who I'm sure probably visited her a number of times in the Cornwall area. And I'd like to read a couple of excerpts of Mr. Diamond Jim, a fascinating character. He had a special fondness for diamonds, but his passion extended to all sorts of precious stones. My pet, he would call them. He wore a watch worth $9,000 in his day, which was about $190,000 today. In the handle of an umbrella, he had set a jewel worth $1,500. And he had an emerald set and valued in his day at $20,000. And even his dog collar had diamonds in it. So there's a lot of interesting arcane facts of the people who lived in the region of Cornwall.
His appetite was legendary.
Yeah, those days. Fascinating characters, interesting stories. Interesting piece here on the Ashokan Reservoir, which is in upstate New York. Ashokan is the Ashokan Reservoir is the beginning of the New York City water supply. I'm quite familiar with it back in my engineering career with the New York Power Authority years ago. We built a small hydro plant at the base of the
My brother was actually born
at the base of the Ashokan Reservoir. It which is quite interesting. So it's a fascinating book for railroad buffs or anyone interested in local history and some of the arcane facts and people that lived here. As well as being, if you were interested, it would be a very interesting book for your cocktail table in your living room. So I'd like to introduce author Bob McHugh.
Nice to meet you. Pleasure to be here. And good morning, everyone. Hope everyone had a nice Thanksgiving.
So let's talk a little about, before we get into details of the book, some of your background and why you decided to write the book.
Well, I grew up in Cornwall, and my family, I always said my family came from a family of storytellers. So the history was sort of built in. Well, but Cornwall, I grew up there, Cornwall Landing. I was down there when the last of the buildings were still standing. It's always been an interesting section of town. It has been written about, but it hasn't. So I figured this would be a good book for anybody who's interested in local history, preserving the area, because it's a beautiful park now. It's a beautiful park now, but in its day, for 20 years, that was a lot of our environmental laws were written because of a battle at Cornwall Landing. Con Edison wanted to put a hydroelectric plant there on the mountain.
Storm King Mountain.
Yes, Storm King Mountain, and the fight that was, with all the environmental damage was being done, that was like the last straw, and that fight took 20 years. And I say, basically, the laws we have there are written because of that fight.
I remember that very well. In fact, I'm retired from an engineering career in the nuclear industry, and the Indian Point nuclear plant was engineered and built as a result of the absence of the Storm King Mountain.
Right.
They wanted to build what's called a pump storage plant up on the top of the mountain, which would have ripped the top of the mountain off.
Right.
So it would have been a disaster for the scenic view of the environment.
Movement was hopelessly polluted at the time. Indian Point was going in, so I said this was like the line had been crossed. Everybody said enough's enough.
Right. Yeah. Sure. I'm sure of that. So I was curious. There's so much material in here of the historic background of Cornwall and the region.
Right.
A lot of arcane stuff, a lot of newspaper clippings and so forth. You've done a lot of research, obviously, in order to create this. How long did you research it, and where did you get all of the information, the photos, the newspaper
Well,
clippings?
I am very blessed with the O&W historical side, the railroad side has all the railroad pictures, and the Cornwall Library did a commendable job of taking all of their Cornwall local files from back to the 1880s going forward and putting a microfilm. So it's very, very basic access. They have the old card catalog for us to remember those. They have one for that. You just find the date, they have the film for it.
So was that the prime source
Correct.
of your material for the book?
Yeah.
Well, so you didn't have to travel around to it.
I didn't have to go too far.
That's
It was pretty much all there. Pretty much all, as I said.
I see. How long did you spend on putting the book together?
The original version of this, I think, the original paperback I wrote back around 2010, I think took about maybe a year.
I see.
So revising this, I think, took about, this, little background. This book, the hardcover book, and 4 other ones I did for Cornwall, they have their annual sidewalk sale. So I kind of did a marathon writing back at the beginning of the year, 4 books in like 5 months to get them ready for the sidewalk sale. So I was kind of cranking them out. But I already had the material, so we're just converting it.
I see. Well, you obviously like history. You're a history buff.
I love it.
Do you have any specific focus on history? Is it Cornwall or history in general?
Railroads, Cornwall,
Railroads.
the area.
I see. Very well. Now, it took you quite a bit of time to compile all of the data and organize it into the book, I guess, as well.
Well, it's constantly. Any writer will tell you to this day they'll never consider a book finished. It's always, I'll look at that. And you know.
The book that I just gave you, I must have read through that, picked through it dozens of times. And that's in its 2nd edition.
Right.
And even now, I still find typos in it. And it's been combed through by my editor,
And
by friends of mine and myself numerous
it's still
times.
gonna be.
Just as a point of information, my publisher told me one time that whenever he receives a manuscript, about 10% of the narrative is typos.
Yeah.
So his editor will comb through it all, finish, and 10% of that will still be. So to weed out all of the problems in a book is a very, very difficult
I
enterprise.
heard a comment from a college professor online. He said, "Show me an author who's satisfied with the book, and I'll show you an amateur."
Yeah, that's true. Very well. Now, you researching any new books or anything
Well, I'm
else?
basically just redoing my hardcover. Now, one more fact about this book, the reason this book came about, I've been doing also a lot of photography down the river at sunrise, the mountain, and everybody's been asking me for
Any of the
pictures.
photos in here, did you take any of them?
Yes.
Because some of them are current.
Yes, some of those, any of the current photos like Storm King, I would have taken those.
Oh, I see.
Everybody been asking me for a picture book, so I said, why not combine the two?
Yeah, well, as I said, it would be a good cocktail book as well for anyone. For any guests coming over who would pick it up, they'd be enthralled with the photos, if not the narrative. So it would be a good cocktail book to lay on a table.
And the one, if I may, the one story in there I have about Willis and Idlewild.
Yeah,
I grew up literally not a quarter mile from Idlewild, from what's now developed. I never knew Willis, of course, but I never knew the estate was all. But if you look there, it wasn't just Willis that was a writer on that estate. Lady in there who was an escaped slave, Mrs. Willis, paid for her freedom, that worked as her nanny, and she wrote incidents of a slave girl at Idlewild. That book is now apparently a college staple.
I see. I see.
I'm pushing for, I'm gonna at some point for a marker to be put there for that.
Yeah, very interesting. You should do that. Just for the value of the history, to pique people's interest, they'll look further perhaps into that. And it was interesting, you have a little segment in here on the New York Military Academy.
I grew up right across from it.
I had the opportunity to tour that one time, and it was very interesting. A lot of people may not realize that former President Donald Trump is a graduate of the New York Military Academy. So there's a bit of fame right there for it, as well as other military officers who were quite prominent through history.
Many. New York Military Academy, as I said, I have New York Military Academy book I wrote, and that basically ends before the 50s, where he was on the property. But if you got a minute, I have a great family story about NYMA, because my grandmother we lived right there.
Yeah,
If you know where the Cadet Chapel is,
yeah,
the superintendent Davis wanted to put that across the street up on top of the bluff there. That would have been very dramatic there. Well, those lady there, Quinn, who owned that property, nobody got along with this woman. Well, superintendent said to her, I'm going to give her one price, she's going to take it or leave it, I'm not going to haggle with her. Well, I forget what Grandma said the sum was, but in 1920s, if she had just said yes, she'd been set for life. Whatever he offered, her jaw dropped. All she had to do was say yes. I have to think about it. He walked out and never talked to her again, and her son said to my grandma, I love my mother, but she's an idiot.
well, as I said, I had the opportunity to tour the New York Military Academy years ago after I was stationed for a period of time when I was in the military at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point.
Right, correct.
So I had an opportunity to go and tour the New York Military Academy. So I wanted to make a comparison between the two. Now, obviously, one is a preparatory school, and the other is one of the preeminent military educational institutions in the world. But it was interesting to see the similarities, and they were there naturally, at least from a military standpoint.
Mount Davis, who was a superintendent, Mount Davis is named for him. He was his early military career. He did a lot exploring out west.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Interesting stuff. Now, this book is on the web, isn't it?
Yes,
If
I
people
mean, all
wanna-
my books are on Amazon.
Okay, I was going to ask, how does somebody purchase this, or at least
All the
research
Amazon
if they want
books.
to investigate the book?
Yeah, all on Amazon.
It's on Amazon? All right, very well. What about Barnes and Noble on the
I haven't really done. I have an Arcadia book on Barnes and Noble. It's called Images of Erie Railroad. It's about the Erie's Newburgh branch. from Chester to Newburgh, which has now become the rail trail. That would be the history on that.
Okay,
The rest
I
of
see.
it else is Amazon.
I see. Let's talk for a few minutes about this other book of yours, which I haven't read yet, as you just provided it to me. But,
Miss Cole, just a heads up, that book is not for, it's not an R-rated book, but when I wrote this one, it was getting to the point, I finally just let loose. Nothing is really sacred in this book with the humor and everything. It's true, set to Cornwall
it's fiction, is it fiction?
It's set Cornwall 1920s through the 50s, but Cornwall's the background, the fictional characters. But
Okay.
Cornwall's the background.
I see that this is very well illustrated in old photos as well. Just a sample.
Yeah.
You care to zoom in on these?
The love story, a war story.
Love story, oh
And
wow.
a war story. There's a lot of World War II in this book.
Oh, I gotta read this, it sounds interesting. And this also is on the web,
Yes, everything on Amazon, yes.
on Amazon, very well.
That's
So you and I are going to look into writing, if we can compile enough material on Roscoe Smith.
I'm sure it's gotta be out there. It's just a matter of.
Well, I gave you a listing of
Yeah.
what some of the
There's gotta be
resources may be available. For some of the viewers who don't know who Roscoe Smith was, he was a fascinating character. He began his career in the latter 19th century shoveling coal as a young man in a powerhouse in Tuxedo Park, which is just a few miles from here, for the founder of Tuxedo Park, Pierre Lorillard. And he was a very bright guy, Roscoe Smith was. He didn't have a college education, but he became an entrepreneur, an engineer, a registered professional engineer in the state of New York, and he eventually founded the Orange and Rockland Electric Company. He lived here in Monroe, and he was very philanthropic. He donated a lot of real estate to the town of Monroe. In fact, one of the parks, the main park in town, was his property at one time. And he was a kind of a fanatic in collecting Americana, 19th century Americana. As an engineer, he was fascinated by the technology of the 19th century. So he went around the state of New York. He became very wealthy, obviously. He went around the state of New York collecting anything he could find and buying anything he could within New York and Pennsylvania. And his collection became so large that he ended up opening a museum here in the town of Monroe called the Museum Village of Old Smith's Clove. And there is nothing really published about him of any substance. So Bob and I are going to do some research and see if we can dig up enough data and material on Roscoe to write a
Coming
book.
of electric power was such a game changer. It's gotta be in the old,
Yeah, well, there was a book, I don't know if you know, but the family published a hardcover
Right,
book
yeah, I
about
hear
him.
you were saying,
Yeah, I don't know if you've read it.
I have.
I'll loan you my copy. We get together again. It's more of a family-oriented reminisce of him. But I don't know, I hope we can find enough material because he was a fascinating character.
The New York Times back in the day was very good for that stuff.
Yeah, and there are some newspaper articles published in this book
That's
about him.
right. Mhm.
But at any rate, if you have an opportunity and you're interested in old railroads, history of the region, or looking for a nice cocktail table book for your home, I would recommend certainly this one, which I've read, and probably this one, which I haven't yet, but will. It has some great photos in it, just from my cursory review of it. And they're on Amazon. So Bob, thank you for coming in today. It was a fascinating chat.
Time, yes.
And we'll be keeping in touch after the new year on Roscoe Smith.
Mhm.
Thank you for watching.
Thank you for listening.